Welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. Despite US President Donald Trump's repeated efforts to negotiate a hostage exchange deal with Hamas, there has been no progress in talks. Amid growing calls to recognise Palestine as a two-state solution, global pressure is mounting on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to end the onslaught on the civilians in Gaza. There are reports of Netanyahu's full military occupation of Gaza plan, even as hundreds of Palestinians die of starvation and Israeli strikes. What is Netanyahu's endgame? To discuss all of this and more, we have with us today Avi Meyer, founder of JerusalemJournal.com and the immediate past editor-in-chief of Jerusalem Post, the most read English language newspaper in Israel and the leading news outlets in the Jewish world. In 2013, he was named one of the Jewish 100, the top 100 people positively influencing Jewish life, along with then US President Barack Obama and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Avi has met the President of the United States at the White House, and he conducted the first newspaper interview with the Prime Minister of Israel after his election. Well, thank you ever so much for joining us, Avi Meyer. My first question to you: despite repeated efforts, all talks for a ceasefire and a peace deal between Israel and Hamas have failed. What, in your view, would be a permanent solution to end the war in Gaza?
Well, thank you for having me with you. I have to say, I did take issue with two elements of your introduction. First and foremost, this is not an onslaught against the civilians in Gaza. It is certainly tragic that they have been caught in the crossfire, but this is a war against Hamas, the terrorist organization that launched the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust on October 7th, 2023, killing 1,400 Israelis and taking 251 hostage. I also have to be very clear that this is not a two-state solution that is being proposed by these countries that are recognizing this Palestinian state. The Palestinian state does not currently exist. We hope that someday it will, but that can only come to be in the course of a negotiated settlement between Israel and the Palestinians. So this is essentially the recognition of a diplomatic fiction, which would, of course, not advance peace in any way. In answer to your question, the only resolution to this can possibly be Hamas laying down its weapons, relinquishing its control over the Gaza Strip, and releasing the hostages. That's the only way this is going to end. Unfortunately, what we see happening right now is that Hamas is adamantly refusing to do any of that. It's been made very, very clear, by the way, not least by the Arab League, which just the other day said that Hamas will have to relinquish its control over the Gaza Strip, that there's no endgame that involves Hamas control of that territory, that we have had decades now in which Hamas has used the people of Gaza as a massive human shield to launch their attacks against Israel. That cannot continue. And so that has to be a prerequisite for any negotiated settlement to the end of this terrible war.
Avi, moving on, there are reports that thousands of Gazans are dying of starvation and through IDF strikes. Do you think Israel is justified in its military activities, seeing as it's been almost 2 years since the war commenced?
I think the war was fundamentally just on October 7th. This is an organization, Hamas, that has stated openly its desire to wipe Israel off the map. It has said that it will carry out more October 7th-like massacres until that goal is effectuated. And so I think it is quite clear that certainly the war on October 7th did have both broad support within Israel and, of course, international legitimacy. We are now indeed 2 years in, and I think that sense of support for the war has started to wane in Israel. We're not exactly clear what military objectives are currently being pursued. We understand, of course, that Hamas does still exist to some extent within Gaza. We know, of course, that there are Israeli soldiers who are being killed on a regular basis, but as far as we understand, its primary military force has essentially been decimated. Its commanders have been eliminated. It is a weak shadow of the fighting force it once was. And so there's growing support in Israel for ending the war. Depending on which poll you look at, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of Israelis believe that the time has come to bring this war to an end. But of course, it takes two to tango. And so while there is broad support in Israel for some kind of agreement that would see the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, Hamas has to agree to that. Hamas has to agree that it too will release the 50 hostages it still holds, including 20 who are believed to still be alive, including deplorable conditions, as we saw just this weekend when they released the videos of those two hostages in really skeletal, horrific state. And of course, again, relinquishing its control over the Gaza Strip and laying down its weapons. It has not expressed a willing to do that. And in fact, according to both the President of the United States and his envoy, Steve Witkoff, we understand that they are not at the moment interested in doing a deal, which is why you now have a lot of conversation in Israel about the possibility of further intensifying the warfare in order to finally deal that blow to Hamas that could perhaps bring this war to a close.
Yes, Avi, let's now shift our attention to diplomacy. There is growing global pressure that is mounting on Israel to end the war. France, Germany, the UK and Canada have pledged to recognise Palestine. Do you think Israel is truly committed to a two-state solution? And do you think a two-state solution and recognising Palestine could end the war?
I think that ultimately a two-state solution is the only one that will be viable for both the Israeli and Palestinian peoples. Both, of course, do have the right to self-determination. Both are entitled to homes of their own. But what we see right now is a tremendous vacuum of leadership on the Palestinian side that is interested in any kind of peaceful resolution to the conflict. We know, of course, that Hamas has long been controlled by Gaza, has long been controlled by Hamas, which of course is, again, a terrorist organization that is deeply committed to Israel's destruction. But the West Bank as well is controlled by Fatah, by Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, who has himself engaged in Holocaust denial, who has paid the families of terrorists who have murdered Israelis. He has not made a particularly favorable partner for peace either. And so there certainly needs to be leadership on both sides in order to bring that into being. But the only way there will be any kind of two-state solution will, again, be through a negotiated settlement. It's not going to be imposed from the outside. There's no way that France, the UK, Canada, or any other country can impose that kind of a solution on this part of the world. It will take leadership on both sides, and at the moment, that leadership seems to be absent.
Yes, and Avi, let's now shift back to the Gaza enclave. You slightly alluded to this earlier, but there are reports that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu might be aiming at full military occupation of Gaza. Is this not akin to ethnic cleansing of Palestinians?
Well, okay, we're dealing with two different terms here right now. I don't believe that part of the proposal currently being put forward by the Prime Minister is the removal of Palestinians forcibly from the land, which would, as you say, be ethnic cleansing. He's talking about a potential occupation of the territory in order to, in his view, more effectively neutralize the threat posed by Hamas. Again, this is a position that is not widely popular in Israel. Most Israelis believe at this point that the war needs to be brought to an end. I think that is also a position that is shared by many in the international community who have seen the pain and devastation caused by this Hamas-induced war over the past 2 years. But again, it takes two to tango. And so in order to bring about any kind of negotiated settlement, any kind of termination of these hostilities, which are so badly needed by people on both sides of the border, you need to have a Hamas that is interested in reaching an agreement, that is interested in releasing those 50 hostages that it has held in contravention of international law for the past 2 years. And you have to have it willing to relinquish its control over the territory. And at the moment, we don't see that that is in the offing.
Yes, Avi, and staying with hostages, of course, you alluded to the horrific video that was shared of a starving Israeli hostage. What do you think Hamas is trying to convey here?
Well, I wrote a piece about this yesterday. Hamas is not accidental in the way it shares information in the world. It was a very clearly calculated effort to impact Israeli public opinion, to push Israelis to pressure their governments even more stridently to bring this war to a close. And I should say that it's been quite successful in that respect. You have had voices in the past few days saying it's time to concede that this war needs to end. We cannot have a situation in which our young people are being intentionally starved to death, as we know they are being. We've had other hostages who've been released who have spoken about the conditions in which the hostages who are remaining in Gaza are being kept, saying that their captors are actually incredibly well fed, that just behind the camera in this video are Hamas terrorists who have plenty of food and water, who have air conditioning, and that they're keeping these hostages in these deplorable conditions simply in order to torture them and in order to decrease their ability to survive. And so there is tremendous pressure in Israel, I think quite successfully, again, from Hamas's perspective, to bring this war to a close. And it's also quite notable to see how largely unnoticed those videos were in the international media. I scanned the front pages of every major newspaper in the world on Sunday. There's a website that lets you do that. I went through hundreds and hundreds of front pages. There were exactly 4 newspapers that published this image on their front page, and they were all Israeli, including the New York Post, which is not Israeli, but is aligned with Israel's perspective. There are no other newspapers in the world that featured this image or this coverage on their front page. And I have to say that is an abdication of journalistic responsibility. We saw that last week there were many newspapers in the world that published these images of emaciated Palestinian children on their front pages. They view that as newsworthy. Why is an emaciated Israeli not newsworthy? Why did that not arouse the sympathies of the world? I think that is a question that we all need to ask ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. Avi, with the situation, of course, surrounding hostages remaining a difficult one, how do you think the citizens of Israel are reacting to it? Is there growing dissatisfaction over the inability of the government to get hostages released?
There is certainly great dissatisfaction. I think there is a growing sense that whatever must be done to bring those hostages home needs to happen at this point. We cannot tolerate a situation in which our young people are being intentionally starved to death, as those who have been put on display this past weekend very evidently are. And so there is indeed a groundswell of support in Israel for doing whatever is necessary to bring those hostages home. But again, I cannot stress this enough. It takes 2 to tango. And so Israel can be as willing as it wants to be. It can make whatever concessions it feels are necessary. But as long as Hamas is insisting on holding those hostages captive and keeping them away from their families, as well as the people of Gaza captive, as they have been over the past several decades when they've been under Hamas rule, this war cannot end. And so what we need now is a campaign of international pressure on Hamas, on its patrons in Qatar, Turkey, and elsewhere, to bring this war to a close. This can only happen if there is willingness on both sides. We know that there is huge popular support in Israel. We also know, by the way, that there's popular support in Gaza for ending the war. Now it just falls to Hamas to take that move and finally bring this war to an end.
Avi Meyer, thank you ever so much for your time and for speaking to us on Focal Length. With that, it is a wrap on this episode. For more of the latest international news updates, make sure to stay tuned here on NewsX World.